We're going to move on in today's class session to talk about the Texas legislature. If you did watch the video recording from the Tuesday class session, you know that we used that class session to sort of finish up some material from the previous week. That class session on Tuesday was really a continuation of the topic from the previous week where we were talking about the party system. But there was a very important reason. Normally, I just go ahead and move on to the topic that's on the syllabus for that week. But we have some stuff that we need to talk about in today's class meeting that builds on at least one of the things that we talked about in that Tuesday class session. Okay, and if you watch that video, you'll know when we get to that point, you'll know what part I'm talking about. Okay, at any rate, so I want to talk a little bit today. Did I press record? Apparently I did. I don't remember doing that. But I do need to do this. Yeah, I don't think I could ever operate a switcher board in a TV studio. I would forget to bring up the video. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the Texas legislature and some features that limit the legislature's ability to function as a legislative body and in sort of the way that we might expect or have some expectation that the legislature would operate. You will no doubt recall that when we talked earlier in the semester about the Texas Constitution, we said it was like other American constitutions in that it attempts to impose limits on the authority of government. But we also said that there's an extra dimension to that, or there's another dimension to that when we talk about Texas, that it's really goes beyond just the sort of traditional American concept of limited government in to what we might refer to as limiting government. And if that seems like a subtle distinction to you, to change the participle from limited to limiting, maybe it is, but I really am trying to suggest something to you that I think is meaningful, and that is that the Texas Constitution imposes some restrictions on the legislature that really prevent it, or at least some analysts would say prevent it from functioning as a modern legislature. Okay, so we're going to divide these into two categories. Okay, the first are constitutional considerations. The second are more political development. So we're going to get to that. But let me just refresh your memory about some of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier in the semester. This first one, we don't have to really go into any detail because we did talk about this in class in our treatment of the Texas Constitution. And most recently, you've turned in a essay on Core Competency 1 where you addressed the constitutional amendment process and some of the substantive considerations that you took up in your essays. So I don't really have to say much here other than to just kind of remind you of the big picture, sort of the broad consideration there. And the basic point is that the Texas Constitution is a document that emphasizes what government can do. It's a detailed listing of policy authority. And that's consistent with the framers of the Texas Constitution in 1875, because they had a fundamental distrust of government in general, but particularly of the legislature. And so they are trying to incorporate into the Constitution that they write in 1875 as many ways as they possibly can to take decision-making power out of the hands of the legislature. And in this case, they're taking decision-making power out of the hands of the legislature, and at least in theory, they're putting it in the hands of citizens, because the constitutional amendment process requires the voters of the state to approve or disapprove of any proposed amendments. So, at first glance, sort of a superficial treatment, just barely scratching the surface, what we say is, oh, well, this is a way to enhance democratic decision-making, to provide a way for ordinary Texans to participate in their own governance. But one of the things that we learned, and no doubt some of you probably talked about in your essay, is the fact that most of these amendments are decided by a very small percentage of the population, a very small percentage of voters. In most cases, less than 10% of eligible voters in Texas vote in these constitutional referenda. So what it has led to, what has resulted in, is really a process of decision making in Texas that allows special interests to have considerable influence. And that's really, for example, a argument that the authors of your textbook make, isn't it, right? That they say that the Texas Constitution in this amending process is one that really provides ample opportunity for special interests to become, to have a say, important say in what are essentially legislative matters. Okay. All right. So beyond that, just refreshing your memory on those points. I don't have much else to say unless you have questions. Maybe some things occurred to you that you want to ask about from the work that you did in writing that essay. Anybody have any questions about anything in this area, constitutional amendment process, and particularly as it pertains to the discussion here, why does a limitation on the authority of the legislature? Okay, silence indicates to me that everybody's comfortable with that, so let's move on to the next item. And again, this is something that we talked about earlier in the semester, so we don't have to say a lot here. Let me just refresh your memory on a few things, right? One of the important limiting factors on the Texas legislature is the limit on sessional time. Recall that the Texas legislature meets in biennial sessions. What does that mean? Biennial session?
Every 2 years.
Once every 2 years, okay? And to be a little bit more specific, that's odd numbered years. So for example, in 2023, when January of next year rolls around, we'll have a regular session of the Texas legislature. The previous one was in 2021, before that 2019, before that 2017, and so on, okay? So every 2 years, in odd numbered years, the legislature meets in regular session. And by constitutional provision, that regular session lasts for 140 days. That's calendar days, not legislative days. So until about mid-May, from January until mid-May. And what that means is that under this provision of the Texas Constitution, the legislature must adjourn at the end of that 140-day session. It doesn't matter whether they're in the middle of, some important legislative issue, whether there are still budget issues to be resolved, whether there's some important question about public education to be resolved, or redistricting still has to be accomplished. It doesn't matter. At the end of this 140 days, the Constitution requires that the legislature adjourn. Now, we have to, in the interest of full disclosure, point out that there is an opportunity to expand legislative time. Okay? Under the Texas Constitution, there is an opportunity for special sessions, but it's important to note that the legislature can't call itself in the special session. It's not like they can say, well, we haven't finished really the redistricting plan, so we've got to have another session. Let's have a special session. Who has the authority to call the legislature into special session? The governor, and only the governor, right? But in addition to that, the legislature may only take up, in a special session, may only take up items that are placed on the agenda by the governor. They can't take up some other issue, okay? So yeah, there is an opportunity there to expand legislative time, although in 30-day increments, right? Because special sessions themselves are limited to 30 days. One of the things that, I don't have a graphic to show you. I wish I did actually, now that I think about it, but if I had a graph that showed the number of special sessions, like the graph shows along a timeline in 2-year increments, the number of special sessions, it would show that in recent decades, the number of special sessions has increased dramatically. But can you visualize what I'm talking about? Okay, so that's probably an indication of what? That the 140-day regular session, like the farther we get away from 1875, the more obvious it becomes that 140 days simply isn't adequate. It's probably reasonable that the framers of the Texas Constitution in 1875 thought 140 days is adequate. You know what? If they can't do what they need to do in 140 days, Too bad, right? That's plenty of time. But Texas is very different in 2022 and will be going into the future than it was in 1875. So the kinds of problems that face the state of Texas, et cetera, are much more complicated than they were back in 1875. So it seems like 140 days in any objective sense is probably not adequate. And it's certainly true that if we compare Texas to other states similarly situated, say California or New York or Illinois or some of the other large states, that in Texas the sessional time is by comparison very limited, because most of those states have open-ended sessions. You know what I mean by an open-ended session? Like the legislature, they're probably in most states annual sessions, not biennial. Right? They meet every year, and they meet, like for example, the United States Congress meets every year, and the sessions are open-ended. That is to say, Congress meets until it chooses to adjourn itself, which typically doesn't happen in the modern Congress, doesn't happen until December, sometime well into December. So most states that are similar to Texas in terms of their size, their population, their economies, and so on, are really probably operating more consistently with that model than with the Texas model. Now, why is this important? Well, some analysts pose a very simple question. How much democracy can take place in 140 days? If by democracy we understand that certain things are implied, like a representation of a variety of alternatives, like lots of different interests get represented in the process. Full debate, full deliberation, full consideration of legislative issues. One has to ask a very pointed question. How much of that can actually occur in 140 days? And many analysts, many people who study Texas politics, who write about Texas politics, including authors of textbooks, frequently reach the conclusion that it's really just not an adequate amount of time to have any kind of meaningful democratic process in the legislature. Okay, questions about that? Bicameralism, again, if we just are barely scratching the surface, if all we want to know is what terms mean, bicameralism is pretty simple, right? You'll recall that this literally means two chambers. So the Texas legislature is like almost every other legislature in this country. The United States Congress is a bicameral legislature. And 49 of the 50 states have bicameral legislatures. There's only one state that has a unicameral legislature, and that's Nebraska. I don't know why. I could not, if anybody was to ask me, why does Nebraska, I couldn't tell you. Why is Nebraska different? Okay. Anybody know anybody from Nebraska? You can ask them. I wonder if most Nebraskans know that they're the only state in the country that have a unicameral legislature. I don't know that I know anybody from Nebraska to ask. Anyway, in Texas, we have the typical two-chamber arrangement. So the Texas House of Representatives with its 150 members and the Texas Senate with its 31 members. And okay, so, no big deal. Texas is like every other state and like the United States Congress. But I think why this is relevant for us to list here is because it really exacerbates the problem of sessional time. If you think it's tough to get legislation passed through one chamber, imagine how difficult it is to get it passed through two chambers, because really what bicameralism means in the American context, it's not just two chambers. That's not enough. It's not enough just to know that bicameral means two chambers. What it really means in terms of the legislative process is that in order for legislation to be passed and sent to the executive for signature or veto, it has to be passed in identical form by both chambers. It's not like the Texas House of Representatives can pass its version of redistricting, and the Texas Senate can pass its version of redistricting, and then the governor can just say, okay, I like this version or some other version, right? There has to be one bill. And oftentimes that's very, very difficult to get agreement between the House and the Senate, particularly in any legislature, including like the United States Congress, but particularly in the Texas legislature, where you only have 140 days. And so it exacerbates the problem of sessional time. We also talked about this a little bit earlier, although we didn't develop in any real detail, and don't really intend to go into much detail here today because we've got to get on to other considerations. But let me just sort of refresh your memory what we're talking about here. Under the Texas Constitution, all American constitutions embrace the principle of separation of powers. The Texas Constitution is not different in that regard. But it is important to note that the U.S. Constitution, if we want to use that as our model, creates a system of government based on the principle of separation of powers without ever using that verbiage. You won't see, if you read the U.S. Constitution, you won't see the word separation of powers anywhere in that document. As a result, it functions as a flexible principle, although that's being tested. That's currently being tested. There are some cases before the United States Supreme Court that may test that flexibility. Maybe I can get into that just a little bit here in just a second, okay? But let me make the broader point first, okay? There is a specific statement of separation of powers in the Texas Constitution. It's Article 2 of the Texas Constitution. And it says something like, there shall be 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, and the powers vested in one branch of government shall not be exercised by another branch of government, which we referred to a little bit earlier in the semester as the theory of non-delegation of authority. Does that ring a bell? The theory of non-delegation of authority. So that if we think about, say, how government has operated to a large extent at the national level over the last century or so, okay? We said that, I think I remember talking about this with you guys previously, that we have sort of a little simple model here that we can suggest where, if you think about all the issues that the United States Congress deals with, everything from weapon systems and foreign policy issues, questions about foreign aid programs, and domestically questions about economic policy, taxing, spending policies, build back better programs, banking regulations, environmental issues. That's a pretty big agenda that Congress deals with. And it's been that way for a long time in this country. Okay? Not only is it a lot for Congress to deal with, but it's very a lot of those issues are very complicated. So to think that the United States Congress and its members, 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate, could deal with all of those issues as a committee of the whole, right? Where every single member of the House and every single member of the Senate is going to have some functional responsibility over banking regulations and over tax policy and over the space station and over, all these kinds of things. Right? It's just not realistic. The reason that the United States Congress, or any legislative body for that matter, I tell you what, any modern institution develops a committee system is to promote greater productivity through expertise, right? Like some members of Congress are going to become experts in tax policy. Some are going to become experts in environmental issues. Some are going to become experts in, military issues, et cetera, all right? And there's going to be that division of labor. And theoretically, and I think in practice, it makes the institution more productive. Just like a corporation, right? Can you imagine a corporation operating where all of the employees are responsible for all of the functions? Like imagine a company like GM, General Motors, where all of the employees at the GM plant whistle sounds, like the old cartoons, right? A whistle sounds, and all of the employees rush down to the floor and they start working on the assembly line, assembling Chevy Malibus. And then another whistle sounds and they all go up to the offices and start doing the accounting, accounts payable and accounts receivable. And then another whistle, they all go get brooms and start sweeping up and doing janitorial functions. It would probably not be a very productive operation. So in any large organization to speak of, more than just a few people in most cases, you're going to have some sort of task specialization. Have any of you ever been part of an organization that has a committee system? Anybody in here, for example, in student government in high school or something like that? No? Well, at some point in your life, you probably will be, okay, involved in some sort of undertaking where you have, that kind of operation, where it's just not practical to think that everybody can do everything. So legislatures are no different. I think in the United States Congress, you have something like, in the House of Representatives, something like 27 full standing committees. And each of those full standing committees has a number of subcommittees attached to it. In the United States Senate, you have something like 22, a few, like not quite as many, but still quite a few. But again, the purpose is to promote task. But even with that committee system, it's not really possible for Congress to pass detailed legislation in most cases. I mean, look, it's all relative, right? Because I think for many of us who aren't students of government, that if we were to, an average person, if they were to read a bill passed by Congress, they would probably think it was pretty complicated. It's probably pretty technical, okay? So it's a relative concept when I say it's not possible for Congress to pass, highly detailed legislation. So what we said previously, earlier in the semester, is that what Congress will oftentimes do, or has done historically, at least over the last 100 years or so, is to pass something called enabling legislation. Right? And in that enabling legislation, they will create an agency and give it a mission, usually some executive branch agency, like say the Food and Drug Administration or the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or some bureaucracy, right? And give it a mission. They say, okay, this is your mission, Food and Drug Administration. This is your mission, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, whatever that mission is, right? And pursuant to that mission, they give the agency some discretion to make rules, formal rulemaking, which we refer to previously, I think, as a quasi legislative authority. So that when these agencies make these rules, it has the force of law, just as if Congress had made the rule itself. Everybody on board? I said a few minutes ago, alluded to the fact that, this has kind of been the pattern over the last century, or really more than a century, but it may be tested. I think there are several cases that are going before the Supreme Court this term challenging this basic model. Actually, the Supreme Court of the United States has dealt with this question in other cases, here and there over the years, but has pretty consistently upheld it. But I guess some analysts, and I'm not an expert in this area, but some analysts are suggesting that there may be reason to believe that the Supreme Court might take a different view at this point. We'll just have to see how it works. So I'm just going to tell you what's happened up to this point, for the most part, that the court has tolerated. So when the agency, let's say the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, makes a rule, it has the force of law, just as if Congress had made that rule itself. If the EPA says that you have these ambient air quality zones and you can only have so much particulate matter in the atmosphere, hydrocarbons or sulfur dioxide or whatever the particulate matter is, so many parts per million, okay? They adopt that rule, it has the force of law, just as if Congress had adopted it itself. And then, of course, they go about the enforcement of that rule. So that's the basic model. Now back to Texas here, okay? So we might be tempted then to think, well, it must work the same way in Texas. So let's just erase Congress and replace that with Texas legislature. And everything's good, right? We can now just move on to something else. Now we can't, because you have this specific statement of separation of powers in the Texas Constitution that says, in effect, as it applies here to what we're talking about, the Texas legislature cannot delegate rulemaking authority to the executive branch. It's called the theory of non-delegation. Unless what? Unless there is some specific provision added to the Constitution allowing it in a particular circumstance. A constitutional amendment is added. Okay, so to go back here to the original point, okay, a little bit of a digression there, but I think necessary. Okay, let's go back to the original point, though. We're talking about here factors that limit the ability of the Texas legislature to be responsive to changing conditions and circumstances. This is one of them, particularly taken in the context of the limit on sessional time. It might be nice, given the short 140-day session, if the Texas legislature could do this as a general rule, but it can't. Okay, all right, and then the last thing I have here, and I don't know that we actually got into this at all in our previous treatment of the Texas Constitution. If we did, it'll just be review for you. Okay, so under the Texas Constitution, the salaries of members of the legislature are set by the Constitution. And I should have asked you, based on your reading, how many of you remembered what the salary was?
It's like 200.
Well, it's actually up here on the screen.
7,000.
Yeah, it's actually up there on the screen. That's what I'm saying. I should have asked you before I put it up there. Okay. But I wonder, like if we were to ask just Texans on the street, like people we encounter randomly on the street, how much do you think members of the Texas legislature make? I bet most Texans would be shocked. You're not shocked because you already read it in the textbook, right? But I think most Texans would probably be shocked to learn that it's $7,200. I mean, you can make more than that at McDonald's. Easily make more than that at McDonald's, right? And that's set by the Texas Constitution. To change that would require constitutional amendment. And it's been that way for a long time. I don't think that's the original amount, but it's been that way for decades. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I will do exactly what the authors of the textbook do and tell you that there is a per day stipend. Do you remember how much it is? Is it 180? Is that what they tell you? Is it $180 a day?
I think it's 200. It's like a low couple hundred.
Yeah, well, whatever the exact amount is when you do the arithmetic, that comes out to about $11,000 while the legislature's in session. Say, so the first year of the biennium, around $11,000, something like that. And then the second year of the biennium, if the legislature's in special session, they would get the $180 per day while it's in session. But if it's not in session, if there's not a special session, it's just the $7,200. So that's, put those two together. I guess that's where the $20,000 amount comes from. Most Texans are probably imagining that they make $100,000 or more, something like that, like it's a professional body. But, that's one of the arguments that people, obviously we keep it this way, right? You can amend the Texas Constitution, but this is one of the provisions of the Texas Constitution that doesn't get amended. The last time I can remember there ever being a referendum on the matter of legislative salaries was, I think, in the early 1990s. There was an amendment that was offered to the voters, a referendum that was offered to the voters that would have tied the salaries of legislators to the salary of the governor. And I think, I can't remember what the percentage was, but it might have been like 40%. Like salaries for legislators will be 40% of the governor's salary. So I honestly just can't remember what the percentage was, but some percentage of the governor's salary. So let's just say for last, it's 50%. If the governor's salary is $200,000, that would mean that the legislator's salary would be $100,000. A significant bump, to be sure, but it failed miserably. Voters rejected that. Not even close. And there are those who argue against raising legislative salaries. And typically the argument that they make is, we don't want professional politicians. We don't want people serving in the legislature who are doing it for the salary. We want people in the legislature who are doing it because they love Texas and they want to do good for Texas. The prospects of being financially rewarded are not what drives them. The citizen legislator model, as opposed to the professional politician. And for a lot of people, that has a lot of appeal. That argument has a lot of appeal. What's the counter argument to that, though? Why would it be better for the, you may not agree with this argument. Are you all capable of making arguments that you don't necessarily agree with? I think you are. Huh? So what would be the argument that someone who would say, no, what we really need to do is raise legislative salaries? I make arguments sometimes that I don't agree with. In fact, I do it all the time. It's kind of, I see it as part of my job.
Sounds like, so why they shouldn't raise it?
No, this is the basic argument that you'll get as to why it shouldn't be raised. Let's keep it at $7,200 because we want to keep the citizen legislator model intact. But there are, believe it or not, some who say, no, what we ought to do is raise legislative salaries. And I'm just trying to get you to consider what possible arguments they might make in favor of increasing the legislative salary. Well, let me ask you a question. You all work? How many of you have jobs? Assuming your employer would give you 4.5 months off to go play legislator in Austin, how many of you could afford to do that at $7,200? Even with the per diem? You'd probably eat up that per diem, literally eat it up in restaurant meal, right? Oh, if you're in the legislature, you're eating restaurant meals, right? Because that's how you make contacts with people and so on, right? So I'm being, I think, literal when I say you can eat it up, you know. So $7,200, and by the way, you're going to have to maintain a residence while you're in Austin, because after all, your permanent residence is here in Sugar Land, or wherever it is that you live here locally, right? So you're going to have to pay for an apartment, right? Or some sort of living arrangements, right? How many of you can afford to do that? Well, that's the basic argument that some people make, is it limits who can serve in the legislature. Most Texans could not, even if they wanted to, which they don't want to, most Texans don't want to, but even if they wanted to, they couldn't, by economic necessity, they could not afford to serve in the legislature. It would hurt them economically to serve in the legislature. So typically you get a certain type of person in the legislature, people who are financially independent, right? We have historically had a lot of lawyers in the Texas legislature, right? People who can turn over their practice to their partner while they go over to Austin for 4.5 months to be legislator, or people who own their own businesses and they can hire somebody to come in and run their business for 4.5 months. Or historically, for example, lots of big farming interest, you know, like farmers. We're talking about, you know, like not the small family farm, but like big farm, you know, big acreage kind of farms. Yeah, commercial farmers. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Okay? So we've had a lot of those kinds of people in the Texas legislature. It's not a cross section of the population of Texas. It's not a portrait in miniature of Texas. So that's the main argument that you get from people who say we ought to raise legislative salaries. Now, I will say in response to that, that in other states, like say California or New York, where legislators are paid considerably more, and in the United States Congress, where legislators are paid considerably more, they typically are still independently wealthy. But that may have more to do with the cost of running for office in the first place than it does the salary. Okay. Anyway, it's a debate that's out there. Okay. And some would say that if you want the Texas legislature to be more responsive to a wide range of interests in Texas, start with increasing legislative salaries, because then you'll get a different type of Texan serving in the legislature. That's the basic logic that I'm trying to get across. Okay. All right. Having dealt with all those, let's quit because we're going to run out of time and we got to get this other stuff in. Let me move on to the political stuff. These are not constitutional features. These are just sort of things that have emerged in the Texas system as it pertains to the legislature. And really, I only have two things on the list here, and they are interrelated. They're very much interrelated. So the first is what I refer to as the no-party legislature. Historically in Texas, we've had a no-party legislature. Even though we've had Democrats and Republicans in the Texas legislature. So we got to talk here for at least a few minutes about why I refer to it, what would prompt me to refer to it as a no-party legislature. But more importantly, what are the repercussions of that no-party legislature? And I think the bottom line for us is that it has led to a political situation in Texas where there is a concentration of political authority in the hands of the legislative leadership and the presiding officers of the Texas legislature. I'm talking about the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor are among the most powerful political leaders anywhere, not just in Texas, but anywhere in the United States. We know, because we previously alluded to this fact, that we have, we have for many, many years in classes like this referred to the governor of Texas as being a weak executive. And we have a topic on the governor in the executive branch when we come back from spring break, so we'll have a chance to develop this. But, you remember from the lecture that we watched, Professor Murray even made this point. He said, we talk about the Texas governor being a weak executive. So the formal powers of the Texas governor, we've traditionally been so limited that we've, compared to other state governors, we've said that the Texas governor is one of the weakest. Informally, there are some factors that enhance the power of the governor. But as I say, that's something we can get to next week, not including spring break. I won't be here to talk about that over spring break. But it's different. It's a different story entirely when we talk about the formal powers of the presiding officers. They are among the most powerful political leaders that we find in the American system. Again, I'm talking specifically about the House and the Lieutenant Governor. I think it's one reason why some politicians in Texas have aspired to the Lieutenant Governor's office rather than the governor's office. Particularly influential political leaders like, say, Bob Bullock or Bill Hobby or somebody like that in the past. Okay, so what do we mean? Let's pick this apart in the 26 minutes that we have remaining. Let's talk about what, some of the specifics here, what we mean by this. What do I mean by a no-party legislature? Okay, so to try to make that point, I want to remind you of something that we talked about last week. Okay, you'll remember this little characterization of what a political party is. By the way, this is not mine. I think almost every introductory government textbook I've ever seen has some similar sort of presentation, okay? Where they talk about three components of a political party. Up here, the party and the electorate, it's just the voters, people who pretty loosely identify with the party. They say, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, may or may not consistently vote for the party's candidates. I like to describe it as the passive element of the party. Okay? They're like consumers. Okay? Everybody remember that discussion from last week? Okay? Down here we have the party organization. The party organization, I think the authors of your textbook do a really bang-up job of describing the party organization. So I'm not going to go into that. It's just enough to say that we're talking about the internal party offices, like the party chairs, the state party chairs, the county chairs, the precinct chairs, etc. And over here we have the party and government. We described that previously as all the people who are elected to governmental office under the party rubric. All the Democrats that are elected, from the president and members of the U.S. House and Senate to state governors, to state legislators, to county offices, and so on. All the Democrats, all the Republicans, the Democratic Party in government, the Republican Party in government. Okay? Part of government, though, is the legislature. One of the things, I guess, if it's not obvious to you, because I didn't make a very emphatic point about it, about this little diagram, is that these three components of the party, these three pieces of the party, have different functions. The functions that are carried out here are different than the functions that are carried out here versus here. Okay? So now we're prepared to talk a little bit about this concept of the party and government, but particularly the party and the legislature, because the legislature is part of government. And you all know, you don't need me to tell you this, I think you're probably already aware of this, that if you look at American legislatures, if you look at the United States Congress, if you look at state legislatures, including the Texas legislature, you know that they are populated by Democrats and Republicans. That's not news to anyone, right? So what are they doing as Democrats? What are they doing as Republicans in Congress? What are they supposed to be doing? You know, what is the party? We call that, the term that is frequently used is a party caucus. That term is actually used in different contexts in politics, but the context that we're using it in now, and we talk about the Democratic Party caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives, let's say. We're just talking about all the members of the U.S. House of Representatives who are Democrats. Or the Republican. The Republicans actually in Congress don't call it a caucus. They call it a conference. For whatever reason, they use the term conference. But you should understand that that just means all the Republicans, all the members of the House of Representatives who are Republicans. And in the Senate, there's the Democratic caucus and the Republican. Right? Well, in the Texas legislature, you have Democrats and Republicans too. So presumably there's a Democratic caucus in the House and a Democratic caucus in the Senate. And there's a Republican caucus in the House and a Republican caucus in the Senate. So what is it that the caucus is supposed to be doing? Well, I'm going to suggest three, whoops, went the wrong way. I'm going to suggest three functions. I'm trying to keep this as general as I possibly can, because obviously we could break this down into much more detail, okay? To talk about additional functions. But for our purposes, I think it's sufficient just to talk about three functions. Okay? So I'm going to list these over here on the left-hand side. These three functions include organizing the committee system, selecting the legislative leadership, and providing voting queues. And up here, defining the columns, I have three different models. The strong party model, which I think might be illustrated by maybe, a number of European countries, European-style parliamentary systems. And I have as our example of a weak party legislature. The weak party model is the United States Congress. And here we have finally the Texas legislature, which is our no party model. Even though you have Democrats and Republicans in the Texas House and the Texas Senate, what I'm trying to tell you by calling it a no-party legislature, I'm trying to suggest to you that the party caucuses are dysfunctional. They don't really perform the functions that political scientists tell us legislative parties are supposed to carry out. Among them, importantly, is organizing the committee system. We were talking about the committee system earlier and why legislatures have committee systems, right, as a division of labor. So the question then becomes, well, how do legislatures determine which of its members are going to sit on which committees? If it's a strong party model, That's going to be done by the party caucus. The party caucus is going to make that determination. Even in our weak party model, the United States Congress, that's done by the party caucus. So, for example, what we find in the United States Congress, which of the two parties has a majority of seats in the United States House of Representatives? Anybody know? The Democrats. It's a very slim majority, though. That's only a handful of seats, but they have a majority. Would it surprise you if I told you that if you looked at those individual committees, the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, the House Committee on Agriculture, Forestry, and Nutrition, whatever it's called, right? All those substantive committees, that the Democrats have a majority on each of those committees? Probably wouldn't surprise you, right? Would it surprise you if I told you that the chairs of each of those committees are Democrats? No. The reason for that is that the party caucus, the Democratic Party caucus, is making those determinations. And they want to maintain that majority on each of those committees. And it's not just something that the Democrats do. Trust me, when the Republicans are the majority party, on each of those committees, there's a Republican majority. And each of those committee chairs are Republicans. In fact, I have a graph. I forgot. I have a graph. Bear with me here for just a second. Here's a graphic that shows just that, although it's just from the Senate. This is from the previous 115th Congress. We're currently in the 117th Congress. This is 2017 to 2019, when the Republicans had a majority. I just haven't updated this in a few years. So you have all of the standing committees listed here in the Senate, and we said that the Republicans had a majority in the Senate at that time. So all of the committees are chaired by Republicans. Here it is from 100. Oh, I do have more recent. This is 116th Congress. So notice, for example, in the 116th Congress, the Republicans still have a majority. Okay, so all the committee chairs are Republicans. But then in the 117th Congress, that's the current Congress, the Democrats are the majority. And so all the committee chairs are Democrats. Here's the House. Again, Republicans with the majority in the 115th Congress, Democrats with the majority in the 116th Congress, and the 117th Congress, right? All Democrats are chairs. And it doesn't show it on those graphics. It would be way too cluttered, but maybe you can just take my word for it. They have majorities on each of those committees. Okay? Now let's look at the Texas legislature. Here is not the current legislature, the previous legislature. We're now in the 87th legislature, I think. This is the 86. I'm not absolutely sure about that. It doesn't. Let's just say 2021. In the 2021 biennium, okay? This actually is the current biennium. I'm sorry. Okay, 2021 to 2022. Okay. The Speaker of the House is Phelan, Dan. I think his first name is Dan Phelan. He's a Republican. The Republicans have the majority, but look at these committees. So you can see that the Republicans have majorities on each of the committees, but notice that you do have some Democratic committee chairs. Going back to 2011, 28% of the committees were chaired by Democrats under Republican Speaker Joe Straus. And in 2013, 33%. In 2015, 22%. In 2017, 29%, 33%. And in the current Texas House of Representatives, 39% of the committee chairs are held by Democrats. You would never see that in the United States Congress. Democrats, if they're the majority party, they're going to chair the committees. If the Republicans are the majority party, they're going to chair the committees. So this is a unique feature in Texas, where we see that apparently it's not all about parties. And here it is in the Texas Senate. So again, notice that even though the Republicans have majorities and the lieutenant governor going back to 10 years ago was David Dewhurst, the current Lieutenant Governor is Dan Patrick. They're both Republicans, okay? You still have Democrats that chair some committees in the Senate. And if we go back to earlier periods that you don't see here on the screen, maybe even if we go back to the pre-Republican dominance when the Democrats were in control, you found Republicans chairing committees. It's been that way really in Texas for a long time. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that it's not the party caucuses in the Texas legislature that determine who the committee chairs are, or even make the committee assignments. Who does? If the party caucuses don't carry out that function, who carries out that function? Well, let's look. I don't think you're going to be able to transcribe all of this, so just get a sense of what we're talking about here, okay? So in the political leadership system, these are the formal powers of the presiding officers. Who are the presiding officers? In the House, it is the Speaker of the House, and the current Speaker is Phelan, all right? And in the Senate, it is the Lieutenant Governor, and the current Lieutenant Governor is Dan Patrick. But it doesn't really matter who the person is for the purposes of our discussion, because it's been this way for a long, long time in Texas. So let's just talk about the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor generally. What are the formal powers of those offices? Well, look at this. They appoint all chairs and vice chairs of standing committees. The party caucus doesn't do that. The presiding officers do that. In the House, the Speaker can remove all chairs and vice chairs of standing committees. The Lieutenant Governor in the Senate can appoint all chairs and vice chairs of standing subcommittees. In the committee system itself, appointment of all members of standing committees. If you're not fully appreciative of what that means, let me try this tact. You're a member of the Texas House of Representatives. You're newly elected, your first term. And presumably you ran for office because you wanted to accomplish some things for your constituents. Maybe there's some specific issues that you want addressed. And you understand, because you've gone to your orientation, that you're going to be sitting on a committee. You would probably like a committee assignment that pertains directly to your campaign agenda, right? And now you learn that I'm going to make your committee assignment. I'm the Speaker of the House, and I'm going to make your committee assignment. Is that an incentive to you to worry about how you operate, how I perceive how you operate?
Yes.
One. What if I say to you, yeah, Representative Bernard, you're new here, right? You're just going to have to understand. I know you wanted an assignment on the Ways and Means Committee or whatever, was that you expressed some interest. But I think your services will be much more useful on the Rural Affairs Committee. But Speaker Fagan, I represent an urban district. I don't have farmers and ranchers in my district. I have a bunch of people who live in the inner city in Houston, let's say, right? Yeah, but I think you'll be much more effective on the Rural Affairs Committee. You don't want that to happen to you, right? So you want to have to play ball with me. You're going to have to probably operate in a way that reassures me as Speaker that I can count on your votes when necessary, right? Okay. So that's the kind of arrangement that we have in the Texas legislature where, the individual members, because if for no other reason, their committee assignments, and that means how relevant they are in the legislature, depends on how the Speaker wants to treat them, or if we're talking about the Senate, the Lieutenant Governor. So that's some pretty awesome, leverage that the presiding officers have over the membership. Now, how about the second thing here? We've identified another function of the party caucuses is to select the legislative leadership. Again, we're talking about in the Texas legislature, we're talking about the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor. So who remembers from the reading how the lieutenant, let's start with the Lieutenant Governor. That's maybe a little easier. Anybody remember how the Lieutenant Governor is selected? Actually elected in a statewide election, right? It's not even a member of the Senate. The Lieutenant Governor actually technically is an executive, right? Part of the executive branch. Although the executive functions of that office are very, very limited and not very important. The real importance of that office is in the legislative functions, right? Presiding over the, by the way, by presiding officer, we mean two things here, right? The Lieutenant Governor is the person with the gavel, right? And we also mean that, or it also means in Texas that has the political power. Unlike say at the federal level, at the national level, who's the presiding officer of the United States Senate? The Vice President of the United States, right? Now, the Vice President of the United States technically is the person with the gavel, at least when the Vice President is present in the chamber, right? Oftentimes isn't even present in the chamber. He's off in Chile talking to the leaders of Chile, or about immigration policy or something, right? So the gavel gets handed off. But even when the Vice President is present in the chamber, the Vice President is not the political influence, is not the source of political authority. That devolves to the majority leader of the United States Senate. Anybody know who that is currently? The majority leader of the United States Senate is a senator from New York. His name is Chuck Schumer. If the Republicans regain a control majority of the Senate in the next election, it'll most likely be Mitch McConnell. Who is it in the House of Representatives? Who's the person with the gavel? She is, what's her office? The Speaker of the House. So she's the person with the gavel. She's also the person with the political pull, right? So that's the way that it works in the U.S. House of Representatives. What I'm saying is that, if we're trying to draw an analogy between the Lieutenant Governor in Texas and the Vice President at the national level, you can't really compare them in terms of their political influence, because the Lieutenant Governor has both the gavel and the political influence. The Vice President does not. But again, back to the original point, how does the Lieutenant Governor get that position? Well, the voters of the state of Texas elect him. He's an outsider. He's not even a member of the Senate. How about in the Texas House? I'm going to show you a little video here real quick. I can't record it though and put it out on YouTube, so bear with me for just a second. I'll put the link out there for the Tuesday class.